7 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my father neatly aligned his silver fork next to his half-eaten branzino and casually destroyed my life. "We canceled this wedding, Savannah," he said, his voice as flat and untroubled as if he were discussing a minor dip in the stock market. "It's a circus." He didn't blink. He didn't lower his voice for the sake of the other patrons in the dimly lit, Michelin-starred dining room. He delivered the decree like a sovereign stripping a peasant of her land, a decision made in a room I wasn't allowed inside, merely handed down for my compliance. Across the linen tablecloth, my mother dabbed her mouth, folding her napkin with surgical precision, sealing my humiliation into a neat, reasonable little box. "It's not too late to fix this mistake, darling," she purred, her faux sympathy dripping with arsenic. "It is simply not smart to marry a man whose entire career is based at a non-profit. He can't elevate you." Then came Candace. My sister leaned back, swirling her Chardonnay, an ugly, triumphant smirk stretching across her flawless face. She had been starving for this exact moment. "Face it, Savannah. You're useless. You can't even afford to pay for your own wedding. You're just playing dress-up on Dad's dime." The words didn't echo in the hushed restaurant. They didn't need to. They landed clean, sharp, and surgically deep. All three of them leaned in slightly, their eyes locked on me, waiting for the performance they felt entitled to. They were waiting for the trembling lip, the tears, the pathetic, broken begging. They wanted the chaotic, emotional Savannah to validate their narrative, that I was weak, a charity case, and they were the saviors. I looked at the three of them, the people whose blood ran in my veins, who had just set fire to my future for sport. The boiling rage of being completely, utterly degraded didn't spill over. Instead, something inside me snapped and instantly froze over. I didn't defend Ethan's honor. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't shed a single tear. I simply nodded once, holding my father's cold gaze. "Understood." I stood up, picked up my clutch, and walked out. I didn't look back. What they didn't know as they sat there, toasting to their petty victory, was that exactly 7 days from now, the three of them would be standing outside my apartment door, pounding on the wood like rabid dogs, begging me to open it. The drive back to Santa Monica was a blur of streetlights and absolute terrifying clarity. Every mile stretched the silence, amplifying the sheer audacity of what they had done. My father hadn't been angry. He was certain. My mother was relieved. Candace was entertained. By the time my tires hit the concrete of my underground garage, the shock was entirely gone. What replaced it was a venom so cold it burned. My apartment was suffocatingly quiet. I dropped my keys on the granite counter, and almost immediately, my phone illuminated the dark room. Ethan. I stared at his name, my chest tightening with a fierce, protective ache. I took a breath, smoothing the edges of my voice before answering. He asked if the dinner went well, if my parents had finally signed off on the rehearsal details. "I'm handling it," I lied smoothly. "I love you." Both statements were true, just not in the universe he currently inhabited. He didn't need to carry this yet. I needed him clean. I needed to move in the dark. I sat at the kitchen island and flipped open my laptop, driven by a predator's instinct rather than a bride's panic. The dinner hadn't felt like a spontaneous intervention. It felt choreographed. I logged into the wedding planner's portal, my eyes scanning the master dashboard, vendor logs, payment schedules. Then I saw it. Catering. Status, client requested cancellation. My eyes darted to the timestamp, 4:15 p.m., 2 hours before we even sat down for dinner. No panic, just a hyper-focused, lethal calm. I opened a second tab, the floral design order, flagged for budget adjustment review, authorized by paternal sponsor. An email chimed at the top of my inbox from my planner, marked with high importance. "Savannah, we need to talk urgently. Someone claiming to represent your family initiated a full-service hold today." I leaned back in the glow of the screen, the pieces clicking into a grotesque mosaic. The dinner wasn't a discussion. It was the curtain call of a play they had been producing all day behind my back. They thought they were merely canceling an event. They thought I would crumble and crawl back into the obedient little box they built for me. They had no idea. They didn't just cancel my wedding. They handed me the exact blueprint of how to destroy them, and I was going to burn their empire to the ground, secret by secret. I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't feel tired either. By morning, the apartment still felt too quiet, like everything had been paused mid-breath, waiting for me to decide what came next. I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open, the planner's message still at the top of my screen, and started going through every detail again. Slower this time, more deliberate. If something had been moved, changed, or touched, I wanted to see exactly where and when. The catering cancellation wasn't an isolated issue. It was the first crack in a pattern. I opened the floral contract again and found the note about a budget adjustment request, time-stamped within the same hour as the catering change. I hadn't authorized anything. I hadn't even discussed changes with anyone. Then I checked the lighting vendor. Their thread included a short message referencing a client request to simplify the setup due to financial constraints. I read that line twice, then once more, letting the words settle into something that made sense. Someone wasn't just interfering. Someone was rewriting the narrative. I pulled up the communication logs tied to my planner's account. Several messages had been forwarded from unknown numbers, each one polite on the surface, but carrying the same implication. The wedding might not be what it appeared to be. The bride might not be able to afford what she had promised. It was subtle enough to sound professional, but clear enough to plant doubt. I recognized the tone immediately, controlled, confident, just enough authority to make people hesitate. My phone buzzed beside me, breaking the silence. A number I didn't recognize. I let it ring once before answering. The voice on the other end introduced herself as part of the resort's partner liaison team. Her tone was careful, measured. She asked if everything on my end was financially stable, mentioning that a few unusual inquiries had come through overnight. I answered calmly, assuring her that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I didn't ask who had contacted them. I already knew. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly and leaned back in my chair. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't concern. It was coordinated. I opened another tab and checked the accounting section connected to the venue. That was when I saw the refund request, submitted under my father's name. Partial reimbursement requested on the basis of family financial review. The language was formal, almost legal. It would have sounded legitimate to anyone who didn't know the structure behind it. I clicked into the details and found a short note attached. Client reconsidering scale of event. I stared at that sentence for a long moment, not because it confused me, but because it didn't. It fit too neatly with everything else. The dinner, the comments, the timing. This had been moving before I even sat down at that table. The humiliation hadn't been spontaneous. It had been the final step in something already in motion. My mother called a few minutes later. I watched her name flash across the screen and let it ring. Then it rang again, and again. On the third attempt, she left a voicemail. Her voice was soft, almost wounded, the way it always was when she wanted to reshape what had already happened. She said emotions had been high. She said I shouldn't take things so seriously. She said Candace was only trying to help. I listened to the message once, then deleted it without responding. A text from my father followed. Short, direct. Call me immediately. We need to fix what you started. I read it twice, then set the phone face down on the counter. The wording didn't surprise me. In his version of the story, I was still the problem. I was still the one who needed to be corrected. I opened my laptop again and began organizing everything. Emails, timestamps, vendor notes, call logs. I created folders, labeled them, saved copies. If they were going to move through systems and contracts, I would meet them there. Not with arguments, not with explanations, with structure. I sent a message to my planner. No cancellations, no adjustments, no financial changes without direct confirmation from me. I kept it simple, professional, controlled. A few seconds later, she replied, Several vendors had already mentioned receiving instructions from someone claiming family authority. They had hesitated, but they hadn't acted yet. That was when I logged into the resort's internal system. I traced the refund request through the back end and watched the status load. It wasn't processed. It wasn't approved. It wasn't even pending. It was held. A red flag sat beside it, and underneath a single line explained why. Owner approval required. I stared at the words, not because they were confusing, but because they weren't. Something in me settled into place, quiet and steady. They thought they were pulling threads loose. They didn't realize they had already reached a point where the system stopped answering to them. For the first time since the dinner, I allowed myself a small breath. Not relief. Not yet. Just recognition. They had already gone too far to stop. They just didn't know what they had run into. The words on the screen didn't surprise me. They confirmed something I had already felt the moment I saw the first cancellation request. Owner approval required. It wasn't a warning. It was a boundary. And for the first time since the night at my parents' house, I understood exactly where that boundary stood. There was a part of my life I had never shared with them. Not because I didn't trust them at first, but because I learned very early that anything I built would never just belong to me. It would be measured, compared, questioned, and eventually used as leverage. Success in my family was never something you celebrated quietly. It was something you displayed or something you attacked. There was no middle ground. So I stopped explaining. What they saw when they looked at me was someone they could still define. Someone who worked hard, yes, but not enough to disrupt the hierarchy they had already decided made sense. Candace had the career they understood. Corporate, predictable, easy to compare. I chose something different. I built something they never took seriously because I never made it visible enough for them to control. The resort wasn't an accident. It wasn't a lucky break or something handed to me. It started years ago with a small group of investors who believed in creating spaces that didn't feel transactional, places where people came to build something meaningful, not just to impress others. I didn't need them to understand that. I just needed it to work. And it did. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just hosting my wedding at Willow Coast Resort. I was part of the structure that owned it. Not publicly, not loudly, but in every way that mattered. My name sat quietly in documents no one in my family had ever asked to see. My authority existed in systems they didn't even realize were there. I scrolled through the internal dashboard again, watching the flagged requests sit untouched. Each one tied to my family. Each one stopped before it could do any real damage. They thought they were dismantling something fragile. They had no idea they were pushing against something that had already been reinforced long before they showed up. A new notification appeared in the corner of my screen. Operations. I opened it and read the message carefully. Someone identifying as a family representative had escalated the issue. Multiple departments contacted. Tone described as aggressive. Legal action mentioned if refunds were not processed immediately. I didn't react. I read it once, then again, letting the details settle into something usable. This wasn't emotional anymore. It wasn't even personal in the way they thought it was. It was procedural, and procedures had limits. I picked up my phone and called my operations director. She answered on the second ring, her voice steady, already aware something unusual was happening. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I gave her instructions. No financial adjustments, no vendor changes, no exceptions. Everything tied to my family's name was to be documented, archived, and routed through executive approval only. She paused for half a second, then said she understood. Before we ended the call, she added one more detail. The same person had tried to bypass standard channels, reaching out directly to different departments, repeating the same requests, increasing pressure. That was when I knew Candace hadn't slowed down. She had escalated. I set the phone down and looked back at the screen. It was almost predictable. Candace had always believed persistence was power. If she pushed hard enough, long enough, something would eventually bend. It always had before. There had never been a system that didn't respond to her confidence. Until now. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence fill the room again. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clear, focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. I thought about Ethan for a moment, about how easily they had dismissed him, reduced his work to something small because it didn't translate into numbers they respected. They didn't understand that I had chosen him for the same reason I built everything else quietly, because what mattered to me had never needed to be loud. My phone buzzed again. A new message. Unknown number. I opened it and read the words slowly. If you don't cooperate, we will escalate this legally. I didn't need a name to recognize the voice behind it, the phrasing, the certainty, the assumption that pressure would produce results. It sounded exactly like something Candace would write, just formal enough to feel real. I set the phone down without replying. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge what this really was. They weren't just interfering, they were testing limits they didn't understand, and every step they took forward was taking them deeper into something they couldn't control. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking out over the city as the light shifted across the buildings. Somewhere between last night and now, something had changed. Not in them, in me. They thought silence meant weakness. They didn't realize it meant I was paying attention. The resort looked exactly the way it was supposed to that afternoon, calm, precise, untouched by the noise that had been building behind the scenes. The ocean stretched out in a clean line of blue beyond the glass walls, and the late sunlight softened everything it touched. If anyone had walked through the property at that moment, they would have seen a wedding almost ready to happen. They wouldn't have seen the pressure moving underneath it. I walked the grounds with my events manager, reviewing each detail the way I always did when something mattered. The ceremony chairs were aligned perfectly. The lighting plan had been adjusted for the sunset timing. The reception layout flowed the way I had envisioned months ago. Nothing looked disrupted. Nothing felt compromised. On the surface, everything was intact. "Vendors confirmed," she said, as we moved toward the reception space. "No changes processed since your instruction this morning." I nodded once, taking that in. Control hadn't just returned. It had held. We stopped near the main terrace, where the ocean breeze carried just enough movement to keep the air from feeling still. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again, lowering her voice slightly. "There have been more calls, from the same contact." I didn't ask who. I already knew. "They've requested escalation," she continued, "asking to speak directly with senior ownership." I let the words settle without reacting. It wasn't surprising. Candace didn't stop when something resisted. She pushed harder. I asked for the communication logs when we stepped back inside. I read through them slowly, line by line. The tone had shifted. Less polite, more insistent. The language now framed the situation as a financial dispute, suggesting the resort was withholding funds improperly. It was no longer just interference. It was pressure, another layer. I recognized the pattern immediately. If she couldn't control the event, she would try to control the narrative, turn it into something that forced a response. My phone rang before I could close the file. This time it was a corporate partner. Their voice was careful, measured in a way that told me they were choosing their words deliberately. They had heard something. Not details, but enough to ask if there were any concerns that might affect upcoming collaborations. I answered the way I always did. Calm, direct, no uncertainty. I assured them everything was stable, that the event would proceed exactly as planned. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment, aware of what had just happened. This wasn't contained anymore. It had moved beyond vendors and contracts. It had reached the edges of my professional world. That was the part Candace didn't understand. She thought she was applying pressure to a personal situation. She didn't realize she was stepping into something structured, something that didn't bend just because she pushed. I handed the phone back to my side and looked at the operations report again. Every request tied to my family's names had the same response. Denied, flagged, routed upward, owner approval required. The repetition of it mattered. Not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't allow. There was no variation, no exception, just a system holding its line. "They're asking who the owner is," my events manager said quietly. I looked up at her, then back at the screen. Of course they were. That was always the next step. When pressure didn't work, they started looking for a person they could influence. "They haven't been given that information," she added. "They won't be," I said. The words came easily, not defensive, not emotional, just certain. We moved through the rest of the space in silence, checking details that no longer needed checking. The reception area was ready. The staff had their schedules. Everything was in place. The wedding hadn't changed, but something else had. By the time the sun started to drop lower over the water, the light shifting into warmer tones, I stepped out onto the terrace alone. The air felt different here. Open. Uncomplicated. For a moment, I let myself stand there without thinking about emails or calls or anything waiting for me back inside. This was what I had built. Not just the event, but the structure holding it in place. My phone buzzed in my hand, pulling me back. 3 missed calls. My mother. 1 message from my father. "Call me immediately. We need to resolve this before it gets worse." I read the message once, then again, noticing the difference in tone. It wasn't controlled anymore. It wasn't certain. There was something else underneath it now. Urgency, maybe even concern. They had started to feel it. Not the truth yet, not fully, but something wasn't moving the way they expected. Something wasn't responding the way it always had before. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked out at the ocean again, letting the quiet stretch a little longer. They thought they were still in control of the situation. They didn't realize the situation had already moved somewhere they couldn't reach. The night before the rehearsal dinner, my apartment was exactly the way I needed it to be. Quiet, controlled, untouched by anything outside of it. A soft lamp near the sofa cast a warm light across the room, and the only sound was the low hiss of steam as I pressed the fabric of my wedding dress, smoothing out the last few creases. It was a small, precise task, something I could finish with my hands when everything else felt too large to hold at once. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Almost. I paused, letting the steam settle, and stared at the dress hanging in front of me. I thought about Ethan, about whether I should tell him everything before tomorrow. Not just what my family had done, but everything I had never explained. The part of my life I had kept quiet because it felt easier than being misunderstood. I knew I couldn't carry that silence into a marriage. Not this one. The doorbell rang. Once, sharp, sudden. I didn't move at first, then it rang again, longer this time, followed by a heavy pounding that echoed through the apartment, loud enough to make the walls feel thinner. Not a knock, not a request. Something urgent, something entitled. Before I even crossed the room, I already knew who it was. The pounding came again, harder, faster, like whoever was outside believed the force of it would change what was on the other side. My mother's voice cut through the noise, sharp and strained, calling my name. My father followed, louder, more demanding. Candace's voice layered over both of them, quick, breathless, edged with something I hadn't heard from her before, panic. I set the steamer down carefully and walked to the door, each step steady, controlled. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I looked through the peephole. All 3 of them were there. My mother's hair was slightly out of place, her expression tight, eyes wide in a way that didn't match the calm certainty she had worn at dinner. My father looked different too, the usual controlled authority replaced by something sharper, more impatient. Candace stood slightly behind them, her phone in one hand, glancing toward the hallway like she was suddenly aware of being seen. For a moment, I just watched them. Then I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to stand in the frame, my body blocking the entrance. "You need to leave," I said. My father took a step forward automatically, like he expected the space to open for him. It didn't. He stopped when he realized I wasn't moving. "Don't start that," he said, His voice clipped. "We've been calling you for days." "I noticed." My mother stepped closer, her tone shifting instantly, softening the way it always did when anger stopped working. "Sweetheart, we need to talk." I looked at her, then at the door frame, then back at her. "You're shouting outside my apartment at night. That doesn't look like talking." Candace let out a sharp breath. "Oh my God, can you not do this right now? We have an actual problem." There it was. Not an apology, not even an acknowledgement, just a problem. I opened the door a little wider, stepped back once and let them in. Not because they had asked the right way, but because I wanted this to happen inside, on my terms, not in a hallway where they could perform it for anyone listening. My father walked in first, like he always did, like every space belonged to him until proven otherwise. My mother followed, clutching her purse close to her side. Candace came in last, her eyes moving quickly across the room, taking in everything without really seeing any of it. I closed the door behind them and locked it. No one sat until I did. They stood there for a second too long, unsure of what came next. That uncertainty didn't belong to them before. I let it stay. "Well," my father said finally. "Well, what?" I asked. His jaw tightened. The venue refused the refund. Not only that, they said no additional changes would be accepted. "They've flagged our names." My mother stepped in quickly, smoothing over the edge in his voice. "We've been trying to get someone competent on the phone all day, but they keep giving us the same answer." "Owner approval required," Candace cut in, the words coming out fast. "Every single time. It doesn't make any sense." I said nothing. My father pulled a folded document from his jacket and held it out like evidence. "Do you have any idea how much money is tied up in this? Do you understand what kind of mess this is turning into?" I glanced at the paper but didn't reach for it. "You told me the wedding was canceled." "That was before," my mother said quickly. "Before what?" She opened her mouth, then stopped. Candace stepped forward, impatience replacing whatever panic she had felt at the door. "Before this got ridiculous. We thought we were shutting down something wasteful. We didn't agree to be robbed." "Robbed?" I repeated. "Yes, robbed," my father snapped. "We put money into this event and now some faceless executive thinks they can keep it?" I walked past them into the kitchen, filled a glass with water and took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch behind me. "Sloan," my mother said, her voice tightening, "this is serious." "I know. Then act like it." "I am." Candace folded her arms. "You always do this." "Do what?" "This calm act, like you're above everything when you're the reason people are upset." I turned to look at her fully. "That's interesting coming from you." She didn't answer. My father slammed the paper down on the counter. "Enough! This is already embarrassing enough for this family, and now we're being treated like fools. I'm not letting this go any further." The word hung in the air. Embarrassing. Not hurt. Not wrong. Embarrassing. Candace's voice cut through again, sharper now. "Why is the resort acting like whoever owns that place answers to you?" The room went still. For the first time since they walked in, none of them had anything else ready to say. I set the glass down slowly and looked at each of them in turn. They were waiting. And for the first time, they didn't know what they were about to hear. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit between us, long enough for it to become uncomfortable, long enough for them to feel what it was like to not be in control of the moment. Then I walked to the coffee table, picked up my laptop, and carried it back to the kitchen island. I set it down carefully and turned the screen toward them. At first, they didn't understand what they were looking at. It was just a dashboard to them. Numbers, property listings, ownership structures, clean, organized data that didn't mean anything until you knew how to read it. My father leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of it. My mother stepped closer, her hand still gripping her purse. Candace didn't move at all. Then their eyes landed on my name. Founder, controlling shareholder, executive authority. No one spoke. The room didn't feel tense anymore. It felt still, like everything had paused at the exact same moment. My father was the first to react, but even then, his voice sounded different, quieter. What is this? I didn't look away from him. It's the answer to the question you've been asking all night. My mother shook her head slightly, like she was trying to reject what she was seeing before it could fully register. No, she said under her breath. This doesn't make sense. I reached forward and opened another file, then another. Property records, approval chains, internal documentation showing exactly how decisions moved through the system. Every path led back to the same place, to me. You own the venue? My father asked, but the certainty was gone from his voice. Yes, I said, and not just that one. Candace finally stepped closer, her eyes scanning the screen quickly, searching for something she could challenge, something she could pull apart. This is ridiculous, she said, but it didn't sound like conviction. It sounded like resistance. It's documented, I said calmly. Every request you submitted was flagged and routed for executive approval. That's why nothing moved. My mother lowered herself into one of the chairs, slowly, her posture losing its structure. Why wouldn't you tell us something like this? I looked at her for a moment before answering. Because every time I told this family anything that mattered, it stopped being mine. My father straightened slightly, trying to recover ground. We were trying to protect you. No, I said. You were trying to control the outcome. Candace let out a sharp breath. Oh, come on. You're acting like we did something terrible. We were trying to stop you from making a mistake. You called him worthless, I said, my voice steady. You tried to cancel my wedding. You contacted vendors behind my back. You requested refunds for something you don't own. That's not what this is about, my mother said quickly. It is exactly what this is about. My father's jaw tightened again, but the anger didn't land the same way it had before. We can fix this, he said. This doesn't have to turn into something bigger. I held his gaze. It already is something bigger. Candace crossed her arms, her expression shifting again, searching for something familiar to grab onto. You're hiding behind paperwork, she said. That doesn't change what this looks like. I tilted my head slightly. What does it look like? It looks like you're trying to make us look stupid. I almost smiled at that. I didn't do that. You did. Silence again. Then I asked the only question that mattered. If you still believed I couldn't afford this wedding, would you be standing here asking to fix it? No one answered. My father looked down at the counter. My mother stared at the floor. Candace said nothing. That was all I needed. The wedding is moving forward, I said. Exactly as planned. No refunds, no changes. My mother looked up immediately, something hopeful flashing across her face. Then we can still come. No, I said. The word landed harder than anything else I had said. She blinked, like she hadn't heard it correctly. What? You're not coming. My father took a step forward again, instinctively, like the movement alone might change something. You can't shut us out like that. I didn't move. Watch me. Candace's expression hardened, but there was something underneath it now, something unsteady. You're seriously doing this? I'm not doing anything, I said. I'm just not stopping you from facing what you already chose. My mother's voice broke slightly. We're your family. You were, I said quietly, when it mattered. The room went completely silent again, but this time it felt final. I walked to the door and opened it. The wedding will be beautiful, I said, looking at all three of them. You just won't be in it. No one moved, for no one moved at first. The door stayed open, the hallway light stretching across my floor, and for a few seconds it felt like time had stalled in place. My father stood there like he was trying to decide whether to push forward or pull back. My mother's eyes were still on me, wide, searching for something softer, something she could use to bring me back into the version of myself she understood. Candace looked between all of us, her expression tightening, like she was waiting for someone else to fix it. My father recovered first. He always did. He straightened his posture slightly, his voice returning with that controlled edge he relied on when he thought authority alone would settle things. You're overreacting, he said. This is not how family handles conflict. I didn't close the door. I didn't step aside. This isn't conflict, I said. This is consequence. My mother stepped forward a little, her tone softening again, reaching for familiarity. Sweetheart, you're overwhelmed. It's been a stressful week. You don't have to make decisions like this right now. I already did, I said. Candace let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You're seriously throwing us out over a misunderstanding? I looked at her, steady, unmoved. You canceled vendors. You requested refunds. You told people I couldn't afford my own wedding. You mocked the person I'm marrying. Which part of that is the misunderstanding? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted, her weight moving from one foot to the other, like she was trying to find ground that wasn't there anymore. We were trying to help you, she said finally, but the certainty was gone. My father cut in again, sharper this time. This can be fixed. We'll call the venue. We'll clear everything up. You don't need to escalate this. I'm not escalating anything, I said. I'm ending it. My mother's expression cracked slightly at that. You don't mean that. I do. Candace's voice changed then, frustration rising to cover something less stable underneath. Do you have any idea what this looks like? Do you understand how this affects us? There it was again. Not what they did, how it looked. I held her gaze. You're worried about how it looks? Yes, she snapped, because people are going to ask questions. They should. That stopped her. For a second, none of them had anything to say. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed building security. I didn't step away. I didn't lower my voice. I need assistance in my unit, I said. There are 3 individuals here who need to be escorted out. My mother's face changed instantly. Savannah, no, wait! My father's expression hardened, but there was something else there now, something sharper than anger, offense. You're bringing security into this? I already did. Candace stared at me like she didn't recognize me anymore. You're treating us like strangers. You started that, I said. The moment you decided respect depended on what I could prove to you. The knock came less than a minute later. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to signal that something official had entered the space. When I opened the door, 2 security staff stood there, professional, composed. I stepped aside and let them in, giving them a simple explanation. No details, no emotion, just facts. My father tried one last time, his voice lower now, more controlled. You're going to regret this, he said. There's no version of this where you don't. I met his eyes. The version where I let you stay would be worse. My mother didn't speak anymore. She just watched me, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something that might have been regret, but didn't reach far enough to matter. Candace avoided looking at me completely now. Her earlier confidence had collapsed into something quieter, less defined. As they moved toward the door, she finally muttered, just loud enough to hear, "You'll regret this." It didn't land. The hallway swallowed them one step at a time. My father paused just before the elevator, like he was going to turn back, but he didn't. The doors slid open, then closed, and just like that, they were gone. I shut the door and turned the lock, the click louder than it should have been. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still resting against the handle, feeling the absence settle into the space they had filled. I should have felt something bigger. Victory. Anger. Relief in a way that was loud and obvious. But what I felt instead was quieter. I walked back into the living room and sat down slowly, letting my shoulders drop for the first time all night. The apartment was still again, exactly the way it had been before they arrived. Only now it felt different. Not empty. Clear. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a second before scrolling to Ethan's name. My thumb hovered there for a moment, then pressed. When he answered, his voice was the same as it always was, warm, steady, familiar. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Can you come over?" There was no hesitation. "I'm on my way." I set the phone down and leaned back, closing my eyes for a second. The hardest part wasn't what I had just done. It was what came next. Telling the truth, all of it. The first time in my life they didn't have anything left to say. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly, the kind of calm that doesn't ask for attention but settles in anyway. The ocean stretched wide and steady beyond the glass walls of the resort, sunlight catching on the surface in soft, shifting patterns. Everything was already in place. The chairs, the flowers, the small details I had approved one by one over the past year. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt uncertain. It felt like something that belonged to me again. I stood in the bridal suite for a moment before getting dressed, looking out at the water, letting the silence hold me in a way it hadn't all week. There was no tension here, no second-guessing, just a quiet sense of clarity that hadn't been there before. Not because things had gone perfectly, but because everything that didn't belong had finally been removed. Ethan arrived earlier than expected. When I saw him standing just outside the suite, still adjusting his jacket, looking like he had barely taken a breath since leaving, something in me softened immediately. He stepped inside, and the moment he saw my face, he stopped moving. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low, steady, but searching. This time, I didn't hold anything back. I told him about the dinner, about the words my parents used, about what Candace said about him, about the calls, the emails, the cancellations. I told him about the night they showed up at my apartment, about the way they pounded on the door like they still believed they had the right to walk in and take control of something that wasn't theirs. And then I told him the part I had never explained before. The resort, the ownership, everything I had kept quiet because it felt easier than being misunderstood. He didn't interrupt me, not once. When I finished, the room felt different, lighter but also more real. He looked at me for a second, then stepped closer and took my hand. "I'm sorry you had to go through all of that alone," he said. Not a question about money, not a reaction to what I owned. Just that. I nodded, my grip tightening slightly around his hand. "I should have told you sooner." "You told me now," he said. "That's what matters." We stood there for a moment, not saying anything else, but understanding more than we had before. There was no version of this where we pretended things hadn't happened. There was only the version where we moved forward, knowing exactly what we were building and why. By the time the ceremony began, the space felt full in a way that had nothing to do with numbers. Friends, people who had shown up without conditions, without expectations, filled the seats. Ethan's family welcomed me in a way that felt simple and genuine, like I didn't have to prove anything to belong there. No one was watching to judge. No one was measuring what the day cost. They were just there. When I walked down the aisle, I didn't think about the week behind me. I didn't think about the messages I hadn't answered or the calls I had ignored. I looked at Ethan, standing there waiting for me, and everything else fell away. The noise, the control, the pressure. It all felt distant, like something that had already ended. We said our vows with nothing held back, no performance, no hesitation, just the truth, spoken clearly, in front of people who understood what it meant. The reception moved the same way the ceremony had. Easy, real. People stayed longer than they planned to, not because they felt obligated, but because they didn't want to leave. There was laughter, quiet conversations, moments that didn't need to be documented to matter. The kind of night that didn't try to impress anyone, but ended up meaning more because of it. At some point, my phone lit up on the table beside me, a message from my mother. I glanced at it, saw the length, the tone even in the first line. An apology, a real one, or at least closer than anything I had heard before. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to, not in that moment. Because the truth was, the wedding had already happened exactly the way it was meant to. Months later, I read everything they sent. My father's letter, my mother's message, even Candace's short attempt at reaching out. I didn't rush to respond. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing anything. If there was going to be a place for them in my life again, it wouldn't be automatic. It would be earned. Ethan and I built something quieter after that. A life that didn't need to be explained to anyone else. He stayed exactly who he was, doing work my family once dismissed, and I respected him more for it every single day. I stopped shrinking parts of myself to make other people comfortable, and nothing I lost that week felt like something I needed back. In the end, they didn't just miss a wedding. They missed the version of me that used to let them decide what I was worth. If you've ever been in a place where the people closest to you made you question your choices, your value, or the life you were building, I want you to think about this for a moment. What would change if you stopped trying to prove yourself to them and started choosing yourself instead? If this story felt familiar in any way, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Tell me what you would have done in that moment, or what it took for you to finally set your own boundaries. And if you want more stories like this, ones that remind you that walking away is sometimes the strongest thing you can do, stay with us, subscribe, and be part of a space where your story actually matters. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.